Hello, everybody, and welcome to this review video with me, Mr. Ball. This is what I like to call the roller coaster of Reconstruction, because you can see it goes up and down, up and down. It's like a roller coaster. It's crazy. But we're just going to do this just for some quick review of where we've been, looking at the history of slavery, the abolitionist movement, and really racial equality in the United States. It's a crazy story, and I know it's a lot of time, so just some quick review in this video. So where the story starts is, of course, 1619. This is when slavery really officially starts in the United States. It's when the first slave ships show up to what would become the United States with the first African slaves. That's really when it starts. And then we have over 200 years, about 250 years of straight up absolute complete slavery in the United States. And what we saw in our last unit during the Civil War was about the early 1800s, around the 1820s. We get the beginning of the abolitionist movement, where people are working to abolish or formally end slavery. And this is where things start to get a little bit better, where kind of people's ideas, thinking about slavery starts to slowly change because of the hard work of the people that we looked at in Unit 3. And eventually, people's minds start to change about slavery. And like, yeah, we should start to end this. And this builds towards the Civil War. If it wasn't before the abolitionists, there wouldn't have been a Civil War because the Civil War was about slavery and the divisions created by slavery. So things start to get good in the Civil War. The abolitionists are like, yes, this is finally our time to once and for all end the system of slavery across the entire country. And things start to get pretty good during the Civil War. But then you can see it goes down a little bit because the abolitionists get pretty disappointed by people like Abraham Lincoln, who, even though the Civil War was caused because of the differences between slavery in the North and the South, Abraham Lincoln is like, oh no, this isn't a war to end slavery. This is a war to preserve the Union, just keep the country together. And this isn't about slavery. If we can win the war without ending slavery, it's all good. And so things start to go down. The abolitionists are pretty disappointed and like, come on, Abraham Lincoln, what's this for anyways? But then Abraham Lincoln starts to realize he was wrong. This is a war for slavery and they need to end it. And things start to go up, get pretty good. And then we get the Emancipation Proclamation, where this is, again, where most people get the idea that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. But of course, as we saw, it's not all the slaves. It's only slaves in the South. It's a military strategy matter. But again, this is where most people are like, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. And that's why I made this red line, because for most people, that's where their US history, story, and understanding of what this happened ends. That's the end of the story. They're like, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. We all lived happily ever after. The end. But of course, that's not the end. There's everything else that happens after this. And this helps us make sense of, well, how did we get to be here today? So after the Emancipation Proclamation, again, the Civil War keeps going. Things go pretty good for the North, and they win. Yes, the North wins the Civil War, and the South is defeated. But then Abraham Lincoln gets killed. He's assassinated. And after the death of Abraham Lincoln, things start to go down again because the person who takes over for Abraham Lincoln is the racist white supremacist President Andrew Johnson. And this is a period we talked about called presidential reconstruction, ran by President Johnson. And he's really just trying to bring things back to how they were before the Civil War. Just be like, let's forgive the South. Let's just pretend like nothing ever happened and be friends again. And we don't need to care about protecting Black people's rights or racial equality or ending white supremacy. So that's why things kind of go back to how they were before the Civil War. But then we saw the radicals in Congress were not happy about that. They were like, dude, you're ruining all of this. Why did we even fight this war in the first place? What was this for? Racial equality, ending slavery. And this is the beginning of what's called radical reconstruction with the radicals in charge, and things start to get a lot better. We get the passage of the 13th Amendment, formally ending slavery, the 14th Amendment that we've been talking a lot about, that guarantees birthright citizenship for everyone born here, due process, and equal protection of the laws. And this creates the period of radical reconstruction where things actually get really good, better than they ever were. And this is really the high point of racial equality in the US during the 1800s. And this is where we see the incredible amount of Black politicians, business leaders, people really being in positions of power and leadership, determining their own lives, their futures of their communities. And it looks like racial equality will actually happen, that the goals of Reconstruction will work. But then we started seeing it doesn't last long, unfortunately. And the reason it doesn't last long is because of a super racist reactionary backlash of racial violence by groups like the Ku Klux Klan. They're not the only one. And starting just murdering and killing people, not just Black people, but white people supporting Black people for trying to fight for racial equality. And because of this terror, less and less people start to vote and exercise those rights because of fearing for their lives. It's unfortunate, but that's kind of how it was. And things start to go down. And then after a few years of this, the North just gives up on Reconstruction. They're like, oh yeah, it's been 15 years compared to 250 years of slavery. What's taken so long? This is hard, and it's not as easy as we thought it would be. So let's just give up. Let's just leave the Black people in the North and across the country alone. And when you leave them alone, you leave them with the KKK and other groups who want to kill them. And this really leads to an absolute reign of terror and violence in the South, ultimately leading to what's known as the Jim Crow South, or segregation, where people are divided by race, have different kind of accommodations and opportunities in their lives. And really, this is unfortunately the white supremacists get what they wanted, which was to recreate slavery by another name, to bring things back how they were before the Civil War, where Black people really had no say over their lives, no equality or rights, and white people were absolutely in charge. And this really is unfortunate because they reached their goal of essentially recreating slavery in a different name. And this is going to be the end of the 1900s. We're going to keep looking at what happens after this. Things eventually start to go up. But that's why we have the civil rights movement in the 1960s, is because they're trying to get back to where things were at the high point of Reconstruction. And so it's important to look at this roller coaster, the ups and the downs. It's complicated. But again, most people just get end of the story at this red line. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Everyone lives happily ever after, the end, and don't learn about all this crazy ups and downs. And it's important to get the full story. If we want to understand why the United States still has such a massive problem with racial violence, why the civil rights movement had to happen in the 1960s with people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, it's because they were trying to get back to where they were during here, because they have been brought back to essentially slavery by the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s. And I know this is a lot, but again, just review the ups, the downs. Things were bad and they get better, then they get a little worse, and they get better, then they get worse, and they get really good, and they get really bad. It's crazy, but important to understand. I hope this video helped you out understanding the roller coaster of Reconstruction. And if you need to, please watch this video again. But this is where we're at and where we're going to be looking moving forward in our unit for the rest of the school year.